the long shadow cast by temporary rescue tools. They were introduced to stop the bleeding. Short-term fixes for extraordinary moments, tools designed to fade once stability returned. But shadows linger long after the emergency ends. To understand why this still matters today, we need to examine what rescue tools leave behind. Because interventions do more than solve crises. They reshape behavior, expectations, and memory. When Europe deployed rescue mechanisms, the goal was clear: prevent collapse, restore confidence, buy time. And they worked. Markets calmed, funding reopened, institutions survived, but survival changed incentives. Banks learned where support would appear. Investors learned what would be protected. Risk calculations quietly adjusted. Rescue tools altered the landscape. Guarantees softened losses. Backstops reassured markets. Uncertainty felt manageable. This created a new reference point. Stress no longer implied failure. It implied intervention. Over time, these expectations hardened. Temporary became familiar. Exceptional became available. Support became part of strategy. Banks planned around this reality. They optimized balance sheets knowing limits existed. They assumed tools would reappear under stress. Memory replaced fear. The system stabilized. But the memory of rescue began influencing decisions long after the danger passed. And once markets internalize support, the shadow of intervention stretches far beyond crisis itself. As rescue tools remained part of collective memory, behavior adjusted. Risk was not ignored, but it was framed differently. Losses felt containable. Boundaries felt defined. Investors recalibrated expectations. They assessed downside with support in mind. Volatility declined. Discipline softened at the margins. Banks noticed this shift. Funding became cheaper than fundamentals alone justified. Markets rewarded familiarity with rescue frameworks. Confidence leaned on precedent. Authorities faced a dilemma. Rescue tools had restored stability, but withdrawing their influence proved difficult. Signals mattered as much as actions. Hints of withdrawal tightened conditions. Reassurances eased them. Policy communication became a stabilizing instrument. This reinforced dependence. Markets watched authorities closely. Decisions anticipated intervention. Uncertainty became policy sensitive. The system functioned smoothly, but it relied on remembered protection. Private risk pricing adjusted slowly. Fear faded unevenly. Over time, this shaped structure. Institutions grew comfortable operating near boundaries. Buffers were respected, but rarely exceeded. Rescue tools had succeeded, yet their shadow influenced choices long after use. The system was safer, but also less self-correcting. And when protection becomes expected, the absence of it feels like a shock. The conflict emerged when conditions changed. Inflation returned. Policy priorities shifted. Support faced new limits. Markets reacted quickly. Expectations adjusted. Volatility resurfaced. Confidence tested new boundaries. Banks felt the transition. Funding costs rose. Valuations adjusted. Memory of rescue collided with new restraint. Authorities moved carefully. They emphasized normalization. They signaled restraint. They balanced credibility with calm. But removing the shadow proved difficult. Even without action, expectations lingered. Silence itself became a signal. This created tension. Markets searched for reassurance. Authorities resisted dependency. Every step carried risk. The system adjusted unevenly. Some institutions adapted smoothly. Others struggled. Differences resurfaced after years of compression. This revealed the depth of imprint left by rescue tools. They had not just solved crises. They had shaped psychology. Risk perception changed. Discipline had been delayed. Adjustment was sharper. The system held, but it felt the cost of memory. Stability had been borrowed from the future, and now the bill was arriving. Temporary tools had left a permanent trace. The climax arrived with a realization. Rescue tools do not disappear when they're withdrawn. They remain in memory. Europe understood that intervention reshapes expectations. What saves a system once influences how it behaves later. Stability achieved through support alters how risk is perceived. Authorities adjusted their approach. They emphasized credibility. They clarified limits. They accepted short-term discomfort to restore discipline. Banks adapted again. They rebuilt buffers with caution. They reassessed assumptions. They relearned how markets behave without guarantees. The system did not collapse. It recalibrated, slowly, unevenly, but deliberately. The lesson was not that rescue tools were wrong. They were necessary. They prevented systemic failure. They preserved trust when it mattered most. The lesson was that time matters. Intervention leaves a shadow. The longer it stays, the longer it shapes behavior. Today, Europe's banking system carries this memory. Stronger than before, more cautious, but aware of its own reliance on precedent. Understanding this matters now, because future crises will not start from zero. They will begin in a system already shaped by past rescues, and the challenge will not be whether tools exist, but whether markets believe. They are no longer guaranteed. So what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again? The shadow cast by temporary rescue tools is not only a shadow over markets and banks. It is a shadow over the political conditions that made the tools possible. Emergency interventions require political authorization. Even when the interventions are technically led by central banks or resolution authorities, the scope and scale of what is possible depends on political tolerance. Tolerance for using public resources, tolerance for potential losses, tolerance for perception that markets and banks are being protected while households are not. In the immediate crisis, that tolerance existed because the alternative, systemic collapse, was worse. The threat was clear. The costs of inaction were visible. Political consensus, however fragile, formed around the necessity of action. After the crisis, that tolerance began to erode. Not all at once, not everywhere at the same speed, but consistently across multiple European countries. The political costs of having deployed the tools were higher than the architects of the interventions had anticipated. Electorates punished governments that had presided over bailouts, even governments that had managed the crisis competently, even governments that had protected taxpayers more than any comparable crisis, faced political costs that were shaped less by outcomes than by perception. The perception that the system had been saved for its own benefit, at public expense, without adequate accountability for those who had produced the risks. That perception was not entirely accurate, but it was not entirely inaccurate either. And in politics, the distinction matters less than might be hoped. The political erosion that followed the financial crisis shaped the environment in which the rescue tools were subsequently deployed. It made authorities more cautious about using large-scale measures, more attentive to narratives about fairness, more concerned about accountability, more committed to frameworks that impose losses on private actors before calling on public resources. All of those were appropriate responses. They reflected legitimate political feedback, but they also created a new constraint. In future crises, the tools that had been used in the past would face more resistance, more conditions, more scrutiny from electorates who had seen what the deployment of those tools looked like from outside the institutions that benefited from them. That is the political shadow that temporary rescue tools cast. It shrinks the space for future action, not to zero, but enough to matter, enough to make the next crisis harder to manage, because the political tolerance that made decisive action possible in the previous crisis was partially consumed by the experience of that crisis. And political tolerance, like capital, must be rebuilt before it can be deployed again. Europe understands this now. The frameworks it has built since the crisis are designed in part to reduce the political cost of future interventions by imposing losses on creditors before taxpayers, by creating shared funding mechanisms that distribute the fiscal burden, by establishing supervision that is independent of national political cycles. All of those design choices are responses to the political shadow, attempts to build tools that can be deployed in the next crisis with less political friction than the last one required. Whether they succeed depends on whether the shadow has faded enough for political tolerance to have partially rebuilt, or whether the next test will reveal that it hasn't. That is an empirical question, one that cannot be answered in advance, only by the next crisis, which will come, as it always does. So, what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again? The long